Hello everyone, and welcome to vlog number 59 in our series about men and women from the Bible. And today we're going to look at a man called Achan in Joshua chapter 7. The chapter's not a particularly happy one, but we can learn a lot from it. Now, a bit of background first. In chapter 6 of Joshua, we read about how God gave very clear instructions to the people of Israel about how they were to attack the great fortress city of Jericho. They were to march around the city several times, they were to blow ram's horns, and they were to shout, and the walls would fall down. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. The people obeyed, and they went into the city and took it. But the Lord had given very clear instructions that they were not to plunder the city, but they were to bring the devoted things before the Lord. Chapter 6 verse 18 says, "But keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them." Now, the next city was much smaller. It was called Ai. And when the spies returned, they said that the city was much weaker, and a force of just a few thousand men would be enough to capture it. And Joshua listened to this advice and expected an easy victory, but he was shocked when instead they had defeat, and 36 of Joshua's men were killed. And we read that Joshua was completely distraught, and he started to blame God for the defeat, asking why he had abandoned them. In verse 7 it says, "Why did you bring us here if we were going to be defeated?" He was also worried that his own men would lose courage because of it. Verse 5 says, "They melted in fear and became like water." He also was concerned that his enemies would take heart and would no longer think that the Israelites were invincible. Verse 8 says, "The Canaanites and the other people of the country will hear about this. They'll surround us and wipe out our name from the face of the earth." And they were also concerned that God would no longer be respected by his enemies. Now, in response, the Lord was not particularly pleased, and he said in verse 10, "Stand up, what are you doing down there on your face?" And he explained that the reason for their defeat was that they had disobeyed God's instructions, because someone in the army had plundered Jericho. So they did a search, and they found out that Achan, from the tribe of Judah, was the culprit. And he admitted to taking the devoted things that should have been sacrificed to God. There was a beautiful robe, there were bars of silver and gold. The consequence was that he and all his family were taken to the valley of Achor, which means trouble, and they were stoned to death. So we need to ask what the reasons were for the defeat against Ai. Well, firstly, it could be overconfidence. And overconfidence can be very dangerous. Now, Joshua needed God's help to defeat the giants of Jericho, but over a small city like Ai, maybe he felt he could do it in his own strength. Maybe he felt he didn't want to bother God over such a trivial little place. So he didn't mobilize his whole army. And did he even seek God's guidance? Self-confidence can be a very dangerous thing. And 2 Corinthians 12 verse 9 says, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." A second point is maybe there was a lack of prayer. He sent out his spies, he listened to what they said, but did he pray? Did he actually turn to God and listen to him? And so often, don't we? We do the same thing. When things don't go our way, we tend to blame God. Of course, in verse 7, Joshua said, "Alas, sovereign Lord, why did you bring this people across the Jordan to deliver us into the hands of the Ammonites to destroy us?" So do we blame God in the same way too? The third point is disobedience. And we need to ask, how can the sins of one man undermine the whole nation? Well, Romans 6 verse 23 says, the wages of sin is death. And that's exactly what happened to Achan. But his sins had far more wide-reaching effects. For example, his family were killed. 37 of the soldiers from the army died, and their relatives would have been devastated. And the enemies became far more confident. And maybe people's trust in Joshua and in God were lessened as a result. Now there's a parallel story in Exodus when another leader, Aaron, was led astray by listening to the people and not to God. Moses was up a mountain speaking to God, and the people thought he was never coming back. And they persuaded Aaron to make an idol, a calf out of gold, and then they bowed down to it. And when Moses returned with the 10 Commandments, he was furious. God forgave the people, but there were consequences when a terrible plague struck the camp and many died. But of course Achan was just one man. So again we need to ask, can the sins of one man undermine the whole nation? The answer is probably yes. In history, dictators like Hitler caused the deaths of millions. And then there was Pol Pot in Cambodia, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Idi Amin in Uganda, and maybe even Putin in Ukraine today. In Genesis, we read about how the fall of the whole of mankind began with Adam and then spread to others. And Romans 5:17 says, therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, death came to all people because all sinned. Achan's sin had been punished, and Joshua learned from his mistakes. And the people then went on and they captured the promised land. But just as the sin of one man can bring defeat, the righteousness of one man, that's Jesus, can result in the defeat of sin and in great victory, of course, when he died on the cross for us. 1 Corinthians 15 verse 55 says, where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? So what can we learn from the story of Achan? Well, Achan took devoted things by putting himself before God. And what about us? God doesn't want gold or silver. He wants us. We are the devoted things. And Paul in 1 Corinthians 3 verse 16 says, do you not know that you are God's temple and God's Spirit dwells in you? And then again in Romans 12, I urge you to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. God makes it very clear what he requires of us. Great verse in Micah chapter 6, verse 8. What he requires of us is this, to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk in humble fellowship with our God. And now maybe to finish, a fantastic verse in Deuteronomy 10 verse 12. This is what it says. What the Lord your God asks of you is to fear the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. So, nice way to finish today. So, a lot to learn from the life of Achan. So, thanks for listening, everyone, and have a great day. Bye for now.